The medieval era was a time of contrasts. Castles and cathedrals rose against skies darkened by plague and war. Between faith and fear, this age forged the foundations of modern Europe. When Rome fell, it seemed the light of civilization had dimmed. Yet in its ashes, new kingdoms emerged, blending ancient legacies with fresh traditions that would define the centuries to come. This was an age of warriors and saints, of emperors and monks. While swords clashed on battlefields, quiet scribes preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. Medieval Europe was never static. Borders shifted constantly, alliances formed and broke, and cultures mingled through war, trade, and marriage, shaping a vibrant, if volatile, continent. In the countryside, peasants tilled fields under the watch of their lords, bound by a feudal system that dictated every aspect of their lives, yet offered stability in uncertain times. In cities, merchants and artisans thrived, markets bustled, and guilds shaped trade. These urban centers became the seeds of future economic revolutions that would eventually challenge feudal order. The church stood as the greatest unifying force, its influence stretching from kings to commoners. It promised salvation, but also wielded immense political power over crowns and councils. From the Crusades to the Inquisition, faith inspired acts of devotion and cruelty alike. Religion was not merely personal, it was the pulse of the medieval world. The great cathedrals of Europe, with their soaring spires and stained glass, were more than buildings. They were symbols of ambition, artistry, and the eternal quest for heaven on earth. Knights swore oaths of loyalty, fought for honor, and defended their lords. Yet their world was not all chivalry. Brutality and conquest were as common as courtly love. Behind the fortress walls, noble families plotted dynastic marriages and alliances. These unions could decide the fate of entire realms as surely as any battle. In the far corners of the continent, Norsemen, Moors, and Mongols all touched medieval Europe, introducing new technologies, ideas, and challenges that reshaped kingdoms and cultures. This was an age defined by both survival and ambition. Every harvest, every war, and every coronation carried consequences that rippled across the continent. Though often romanticized, medieval Europe was harsh for most. Disease, famine, and violence were never far away, yet art, music, and literature still flourished. From its chaotic beginnings after Rome's fall to the dawn of the Renaissance, the medieval period was 1,000 years of transformation, laying the bedrock for the Europe we know today. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, it was more than the fall of a city. It was the unraveling of centuries of political, economic, and cultural stability. Rome's vast roads and aqueducts still stood, but the unity they symbolized crumbled. Across Europe, regional warlords filled the power vacuum, carving territories from the remains of imperial provinces. For centuries, Rome had been the heart of the known world. Its decline left Europe fragmented, a continent without a central authority, where survival depended on local strength and alliances. The last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. This event marked a symbolic end, though the transition from empire to medieval kingdoms was far more gradual. Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Lombards, moved into former Roman lands, each blending their traditions with remnants of Roman law, architecture, and language. A new cultural mosaic began to form. Urban centers shrank as trade routes collapsed. Once bustling Roman cities emptied, their marble forums repurposed for fortresses or left to crumble beneath vines and weeds. In the countryside, communities became self-sufficient. Without Rome's network of protection, villages relied on local leaders for defense, justice, and order, the early seeds of feudalism. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, still stood, preserving Roman traditions and law. From Constantinople, emperors looked west with concern, watching barbarian kingdoms rise from imperial ruins. Religion emerged as a stabilizing force. The Christian Church, already established under Rome, became a central institution, offering spiritual guidance and a network that spanned across the fractured continent. Missionaries carried faith into pagan lands, converting kings and warriors. With each baptism, political ties strengthened, binding regions together under shared beliefs, even when languages and laws differed. But the post-Roman world was far from peaceful. Wars between rival kingdoms were frequent, as leaders sought to expand their influence over the scattered territories of Europe. The Franks rose to prominence under leaders like Clovis the Firpius, who united vast territories in what is now France and Germany, cementing Christianity's role in governance. Across the Mediterranean, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa and the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy controlled strategic trade hubs, keeping the memory of Rome alive through art and administration. Yet, not all connections to Rome faded. Roman law influenced the governance of many successor states, blending with tribal customs to create hybrid systems unique to each realm. The loss of centralized taxation and infrastructure meant many public works fell into disrepair. Bridges collapsed, aqueducts ran dry, and roads became dangerous paths through hostile lands. Despite the instability, art and craftsmanship survived. Goldsmiths, stonemasons, and scribes adapted Roman techniques to new purposes, creating objects that reflected both continuity and change. Agriculture became the backbone of survival. Grain, livestock, and vineyards provided sustenance, while surplus could be traded for weapons, tools, or luxury goods brought from distant lands. The church's monasteries became centers of literacy and learning. Monks copied ancient manuscripts, preserving the wisdom of Greece and Rome for future generations. Rome's fall also shifted Europe's military priorities. Without imperial legions, defense relied on local militias and the growing warrior class that would later evolve into medieval knights. Power shifted constantly as kingdoms rose and fell. In some regions, rulers married into rival dynasties to secure peace. In others, they waged relentless war for dominance. Trade slowly adapted to new realities. Instead of long-distance commerce across the empire, regional markets emerged, focusing on goods available within a few days' travel. The post-Roman centuries were a time of cultural fusion. Pagan festivals merged with Christian holidays, and Roman architectural styles blended with Germanic craftsmanship. In Britain, the Roman withdrawal left the island vulnerable to Saxon, Anglo, and Jute migrations, reshaping its language, culture, and political map. Italy saw the rise and fall of the Ostrogoths, followed by Byzantine reconquest. The peninsula became a contested prize in the struggle for Mediterranean dominance. Spain, under the Visigoths, maintained strong Roman traditions in law and religion, even as their own culture grew distinct from both Rome and their Germanic roots. By the 7th century, the old Roman world had transformed into something new, a patchwork of kingdoms connected by shared faith, yet divided by politics and ambition. The fall of Rome had not ended civilization, it had redirected it. In this fragmented world, the foundations of medieval Europe were set in motion. As Europe settled into its post-Roman reality, a new system of governance emerged, one rooted in loyalty, land ownership, and mutual obligation. This was the birth of feudalism. Feudalism wasn't invented overnight. It grew from centuries of political fragmentation, where protection and resources depended on personal bonds rather than distant imperial authority. At its core, feudalism was a hierarchy. Kings granted land, called fiefs, to powerful nobles, who in return pledged military service and political loyalty to the crown. These nobles, or lords, divided their lands among vassals, who promised to defend them and provide soldiers when called upon. This chain of obligation bound society together. For peasants, life was tied to the land. Many became serfs, working a lord's fields in exchange for shelter, protection, and the right to farm small plots for themselves. The manor became the economic and social hub. Within its boundaries lay farmland, villages, mills, and sometimes small chapels, all sustained by the labor of peasants. Feudal society was built on reciprocity. Lords protected their vassals from outside threats, while vassals maintained the land, collected taxes, and supplied warriors in times of war. This system thrived because it addressed the harsh realities of the medieval world: constant warfare, lawlessness, and the absence of centralized government capable of protecting all citizens. A knight's loyalty was both personal and sacred. Oaths of fealty were sworn on holy relics or before church altars, binding warriors with both honor and spiritual fear. Knighthood became a defining symbol of feudal society. Young nobles trained from childhood to master weapons, horsemanship, and the code of chivalry, which blended martial skill with Christian virtue. The church played a crucial role in legitimizing feudal relationships. Kings ruled by the grace of God, and breaking an oath was not just treason, it was a sin. In practice, feudalism varied across Europe. In France, it became deeply entrenched. In England, it blended with Anglo-Saxon traditions after the Norman conquest of 1066. The Norman system centralized authority more than in France. William the Conqueror required all landholders, large and small, to swear loyalty directly to him, reducing the risk of rebellious vassals. Manorial life dictated the rhythms of the rural population. Planting, harvesting, and festivals followed the agricultural calendar, with the church's holy days adding structure and meaning to the year. While most peasants rarely traveled, goods and ideas still moved between regions through markets, fairs, and the occasional traveling merchant or pilgrim. Castles rose across the landscape as both fortresses and symbols of lordly power. They served as administrative centers, military strongholds, and visual reminders of feudal authority. Feudal justice was local and personal. Disputes were settled in a lord's court, where verdicts could be influenced by loyalty, rank, or the practical needs of keeping peace. This localized power brought stability, but also fostered constant rivalries. Lords frequently fought over borders, inheritance, or insults, leading to small-scale wars that could devastate the countryside. When kings were strong, they could unite their vassals for larger campaigns against rival kingdoms, rebellious nobles, or foreign invaders like the Vikings and Moors. Feudalism also encouraged a warrior culture. The ideal of the knight blended brutal military skill with a romanticized image of honor, loyalty, and service to both lord and faith. Over time, tournaments and jousts emerged as both training and entertainment, reinforcing the knightly ideal while offering a relatively safe outlet for martial competition. Peasants bore the weight of this system. Though they received protection, their labor supported not only their lord's household, but also his military ambitions and political obligations. The church occasionally sought to limit violence through movements like the Peace and Truce of God. urging knights to spare peasants and halt fighting on holy days. Feudalism was not static. As trade grew, towns expanded, and a merchant class began to challenge the purely land-based structure of wealth and power. By the High Middle Ages, the feudal system had reached its peak, deeply embedded in every aspect of life, yet already sowing the seeds of its eventual transformation. Still, for centuries, feudalism defined medieval Europe. It dictated who ruled, who served, and how communities survived in a world shaped by loyalty, land, and the constant threat of war. It was a world where personal bonds mattered more than distant law, and where power flowed not from abstract institutions, but from the strength of one's oaths and the land one controlled. The medieval church was more than a place of worship. It was the heartbeat of European society, shaping politics, education, morality, and even the rhythm of daily life. At a time when most people could neither read nor write, the church was the keeper of knowledge, preserving ancient texts and producing the educated clergy who advised kings and nobles. From humble village chapels to majestic cathedrals, church buildings stood as physical symbols of faith and community. Their towering spires pointed heavenward, reminding all of life's spiritual purpose. Christianity was not simply a personal belief. It was the framework of existence. Birth, marriage, and death were marked by sacred rites, binding individuals into a shared religious identity. The church wielded immense economic power. It owned vast lands, collected tithes from peasants, and received donations from nobles seeking to secure salvation through acts of generosity. Monasteries became centers of learning, charity, and agricultural innovation. Monks copied manuscripts, taught literacy, and offered hospitality to travelers, living according to strict rules of discipline and prayer. Pilgrimages to holy sites offered both spiritual merit and a rare chance for travel. Destinations like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome drew thousands across the continent each year. The Pope was more than a spiritual leader. He was a political force, able to crown kings, excommunicate rulers, and call entire nations to war in the name of God. Excommunication was a fearsome weapon. To be cut off from the church was to lose one's place in the Christian community, and often one's political legitimacy. The church also claimed the authority to mediate disputes between Christian rulers, positioning itself as the ultimate arbiter of justice and moral law across Europe. Clergy often served as diplomats, scribes, and advisors to kings. Their education and connections gave them influence far beyond the walls of monasteries or cathedrals. Gothic architecture transformed the skyline of medieval cities. Stained glass windows told biblical stories in vivid color, teaching faith through images to the largely illiterate population. The sacraments, baptism, confession, communion, marriage, and others, structured Christian life from cradle to grave. Each was believed necessary for salvation, placing immense spiritual authority in the hands of priests. Heresy was treated as a dangerous threat, both to the soul and to social stability. Movements like the Cathars and Waldensians faced fierce suppression from church and state alike. The Inquisition emerged as an institution to investigate and root out heresy, using trials, confessions, and sometimes severe punishments to enforce religious orthodoxy. Education was dominated by the church. Cathedral schools evolved into early universities, where theology, philosophy, and law shaped the next generation of leaders, clerics, and scholars. The Latin language unified the educated elite across Europe. Whether in Paris or Prague, a learned man could communicate in the church's tongue. Religious festivals brought communities together in celebration. Christmas, Easter, and countless saints' days offered breaks from labor, with feasting, music, and processions. The Church also defined morality, influencing laws on marriage, inheritance, and personal conduct. Moral transgressions could be punished as both sins and crimes. Relics, bones, garments, or objects linked to saints were treasured as conduits of divine power, drawing pilgrims and inspiring devotion. Crusades, called by the Pope, united warriors from across Europe in campaigns to reclaim the Holy Land or defend Christendom from perceived threats. Such holy wars blended religious zeal with political ambition, transforming both Europe and the wider medieval world through trade, cultural exchange, and conflict. The Church's wealth and power sometimes provoked criticism, even within its own ranks. Reform movements sought to return clergy to humility, piety, and service. The Cluniac reforms, and later the Cistercians, emphasized strict discipline, simplicity, and a renewed focus on prayer over worldly affairs. Despite internal tensions, the Church remained the one institution that spanned every kingdom, binding the diverse peoples of Europe into a shared Christian civilization. Its influence reached deep into the medieval mind, shaping not only beliefs about God, but also ideas about kingship, justice, community, and the very meaning of life. The medieval Church was not merely part of the world. It was the lens through which medieval Europeans understood their world, their duty, and their destiny. Warfare in medieval Europe was not merely a clash of armies. It was a central feature of politics, religion, and the code of honor that bound the warrior class together. Knights emerged as the iconic figures of this age. They were both warriors and symbols of chivalry, sworn to defend their lord, their faith, and the helpless. The knight's path began in childhood, as a page in a noble household, learning manners, riding, and basic combat skills before becoming a squire under the mentorship of an experienced warrior. Training was rigorous. Swordsmanship, jousting, and horsemanship were drilled daily, alongside lessons in loyalty, piety, and the rules of courtly behavior that defined a knight's place in society. Armor evolved from chainmail hauberks to full suits of plate, providing protection against increasingly deadly weapons. A knight's armor was as much a display of wealth as a tool of survival. Castles became the strongholds of medieval warfare. They served as military bases, administrative centers, and symbols of power, their high walls and towers designed to resist sieges. Siege warfare demanded ingenuity. Catapults, battering rams, and siege towers were employed to breach defenses, while defenders relied on boiling oil, arrow slits, and cunning traps to repel attackers. The code of chivalry was more than a romantic ideal. It was a moral framework that demanded courage, honor, loyalty, and the protection of the weak and the Church. Tournaments allowed knights to display martial skill in controlled combat. Jousting, melee battles, and archery contests offered both training and public spectacle, attracting crowds from across the region. Warfare was expensive. Lords relied on feudal obligations to raise armies, calling upon vassals to supply knights and soldiers in exchange for land, protection, or political favor. Foot soldiers formed the bulk of medieval armies. Archers, pikemen, and crossbowmen provided essential support, often deciding battles through skill, numbers, or superior positioning. The introduction of the longbow, particularly in England, revolutionized warfare. Its range and power could pierce armor and turn the tide of battle against heavily armored knights. Religion infused warfare with deeper meaning. Battles were often framed as righteous causes, with clergy blessing armies and declaring divine favor for those who fought in God's name. The Crusades exemplified this union of faith and war. Beginning in 1096, they aimed to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, uniting knights, nobles, and peasants under a common religious banner. The First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, leading to the establishment of Crusader states that became focal points of conflict, trade, and cultural exchange for nearly 2 centuries. Subsequent crusades were less successful militarily, yet they had profound effects on European society, exposing it to Eastern goods, ideas, and technologies that would shape the later medieval world. Crusading orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller emerged, combining monastic vows with military service and gaining wealth, land, and influence across Christendom. Chivalry and crusading ideals were immortalized in epic poems and romances, shaping the medieval imagination with tales of heroic quests, noble sacrifice, and divine mission. Yet, medieval warfare was brutal. Battles and sieges brought destruction to fields, villages, and towns, leaving civilians to suffer the consequences of noble ambitions. Mercenaries, known as free companies, roamed Europe between wars, sometimes serving lords, other times pillaging the countryside when payment failed or opportunities for plunder arose. Naval warfare also grew in importance, especially during crusades and coastal conflicts. Fleets transported armies, blockaded ports, and fought for control of lucrative trade routes. The 100 Years' War between England and France epitomized the era's military conflicts, blending feudal disputes, dynastic claims, and national identity with innovations in tactics and weaponry. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 demonstrated how strategy and technology, in this case the longbow, could overcome superior numbers and traditional knightly warfare. Honor in battle was balanced with pragmatism. Ransoming captured nobles was a common practice, offering profit to victors while sparing the lives of valuable prisoners. Castles and fortifications adapted to new threats, incorporating thicker walls, angled bastions, and improved gatehouses to resist siege weapons and early gunpowder artillery. The late medieval period saw the gradual decline of the knight as gunpowder weapons and professional standing armies began to reshape the nature of warfare. Despite this, the ideals of chivalry continued to influence noble behavior, diplomacy, and literature, even as the realities of war became increasingly dominated by new technologies. Daily life in medieval Europe varied greatly depending on class, location, and period. Yet certain rhythms, tied to the seasons, the church calendar, and local traditions, shaped everyone's existence. For peasants, life revolved around agriculture. Planting, tending, and harvesting crops filled the year, with work intensifying in summer and autumn, and easing slightly in the harsh, slow winter months. Most peasants lived in small villages. Homes were simple wooden or wattle and daub structures with thatched roofs, often shared with animals for warmth during cold months. A medieval peasant's diet relied heavily on bread, pottage, a thick vegetable stew, and seasonal produce. Meat was rare, reserved for special occasions or obtained through hunting. Nobles lived in larger stone houses or castles, enjoying better diets with more meat, fish, and imported goods, though their lives were still dictated by feudal responsibilities and seasonal demands. The manor formed the center of rural life. Lords managed land, collected rents, and provided protection, while peasants worked fields in exchange for shelter and the right to farm small plots. Markets and fairs brought communities together, allowing trade in goods like cloth, tools, spices, and livestock. They also served as social and cultural gatherings, often featuring entertainers, games, and feasts. Craftsmen in towns produced specialized goods. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons, weavers created cloth, and bakers supplied bread, each trade forming part of a tightly regulated guild system. Guilds maintained quality, set prices, and trained apprentices, ensuring the survival of skills across generations, while also wielding political influence in growing towns. Religion permeated daily life. The church dictated holidays, moral conduct, and rites of passage, baptisms, marriages, and funerals, marking each stage of life with spiritual significance. Education was rare for commoners. Literacy was largely confined to clergy and some nobility, though cathedral schools and later universities began expanding opportunities for the educated elite. Children contributed to family labor from a young age, helping in fields, tending animals, or assisting with crafts, while learning the roles expected of them in adulthood. Clothing reflected status. Peasants wore simple wool garments dyed in earthy colors, while nobility adorned themselves in fine fabrics like silk and velvet, often in bright, costly dyes. Travel was slow and limited. Most people lived their entire lives within a day's walk of their birthplace, except for traders, pilgrims, or soldiers. Pilgrimages were important religious journeys, undertaken to visit holy sites, seek healing, or fulfill vows, often combining spiritual devotion with opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. Hygiene varied widely. Bathhouses existed in towns, but rural bathing relied on rivers or heated tubs. Herbs and scented cloths helped mask odors in an age before modern sanitation. Medical care was basic, combining herbal remedies, folk traditions, and early surgical techniques. The sick might also seek healing through prayer, relics, or the intervention of saints. Festivals marked the calendar, blending Christian and older pagan traditions. Harvest feasts, Christmas, Easter, and midsummer celebrations brought moments of joy and community in otherwise labor-intensive lives. Music, storytelling, and dance provided entertainment. Minstrels, troubadours, and local musicians carried news, tales, and songs, preserving history and values through oral tradition. Disputes were settled through manorial courts or, in towns, by civic authorities. Justice ranged from fines and public shaming to corporal punishment or imprisonment. Women's roles were shaped by class. Noble women managed estates in their husband's absence, while peasant women worked fields, raised children, and kept households functioning through hard labor. Seasonal changes dictated work and leisure. Winter offered time for mending tools, spinning wool, and storytelling by the fire, while spring marked a return to planting and outdoor labor. Food preservation was essential. Salting, smoking, and drying ensured survival through winter, though shortages and famine were constant risks in years of poor harvest. Cats and dogs served as pest control and companions, while livestock like chickens, pigs, and cows provided food, labor, and manure for farming. Taxes and tithes were a constant burden. Peasants owed part of their crops to their lord, and a tenth of their produce to the church. Leisure was rare but valued. Wrestling, archery, and simple games offered recreation, while nobles enjoyed hunting, falconry, and elaborate banquets. The late medieval period was marked by transformation and turmoil, as centuries-old structures of feudalism, faith, and power began to fracture under social, economic, and political pressures. One of the most devastating forces was the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing millions and leaving villages abandoned, fields untended and economies in chaos. Labor shortages shifted the balance between lords and peasants. Survivors demanded higher wages, better conditions, and greater freedom, leading to uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Feudal bonds weakened as serfdom declined in many regions, replaced by wage labor and more mobile populations, unsettling the old order that had governed rural life for centuries. The 100 Years' War between England and France further destabilized society, draining resources, spreading destruction, and eroding the power of traditional nobility as professional armies replaced feudal levies. Advances in military technology, such as the longbow, pike formations, and early cannons, shifted warfare away from knightly combat, signaling the decline of chivalric ideals and castle dominance. The late Middle Ages also saw growing discontent with the Church. Corruption, political entanglements, and extravagant spending eroded public trust in religious institutions once seen as unshakable. Movements like the Lollards in England and the Hussites in Bohemia challenged church authority, calling for reform, scriptural access, and a return to spiritual purity. Urban growth accelerated, with towns and cities becoming centers of trade, craftsmanship, and new ideas, fostering a merchant class that wielded increasing economic and political influence. The spread of literacy expanded beyond the clergy as universities grew and more laypeople learned to read, paving the way for intellectual movements that questioned traditional authority. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century by Johannes Gutenberg revolutionized communication, enabling rapid dissemination of ideas that would soon fuel the Renaissance and Reformation. Exploration expanded horizons. Maritime innovations allowed European sailors to push into the Atlantic, seeking new trade routes that would connect continents and transform economies. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453 shocked Europe, cutting off eastern trade routes and prompting intensified exploration and cultural exchanges with the Islamic world. Art, once dominated by purely religious themes, began incorporating realism, perspective, and human-centered subjects, reflecting shifting worldviews and a curiosity about nature, science, and the human experience. Economic crises, including fluctuating grain prices and recurring plagues, made survival uncertain, driving communities to adapt or collapse in the face of relentless challenges. Royal power began consolidating in stronger centralized states, diminishing the independence of feudal lords and laying foundations for modern nation-states. Guilds and merchants grew in prominence, controlling urban economies and investing in ventures that would later fuel exploration and cultural patronage. The weakening of feudalism also altered gender roles in subtle ways, as women in towns took on more visible roles in business during periods of male absence in wars or plagues. Agricultural innovations like the three-field system and improved plows boosted yields, but land pressure and environmental factors still caused periodic famines that shaped migration and settlement patterns. Religious unity fractured as reformist ideas spread, setting the stage for schisms and movements that would permanently reshape Europe's spiritual landscape. Philosophers and scholars revisited classical texts, blending ancient wisdom with new observations, creating a fertile intellectual climate that questioned medieval scholasticism. Patronage from wealthy merchants and rulers sponsored artists, architects, and thinkers, transforming cities like Florence into cultural capitals of innovation and beauty. Castles evolved into more comfortable residences, signaling a shift from purely defensive structures to symbols of prestige and political power. In the countryside, peasant communities still clung to ancient traditions, even as winds of change swept through Europe, bringing unfamiliar technologies, opportunities, and risks. The idea of the individual began to emerge more strongly, challenging the medieval emphasis on collective identity bound to lord, village, and church. Trade networks stretched farther than ever, connecting Europe with Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, introducing new goods, ideas, and cultural influences. By the late 15th century, Europe was poised at a threshold, neither fully medieval nor entirely modern, as old systems collapsed and new possibilities unfolded. The medieval era was a tapestry of triumph and tragedy, weaving together stories of kings and peasants, saints and warriors, faith and doubt. Its legacy endures in the very fabric of modern Europe. From the fall of Rome's grandeur to the dawn of Renaissance brilliance, medieval Europe was a crucible of change, where old worlds ended and new possibilities took shape. Castles still stand as silent witnesses to battles fought, alliances forged, and lives lived in service to lords, faith, and family. They remind us of the era's complex power struggles. The towering cathedrals, bathed in colored light through stained glass, symbolize a longing for the divine that shaped medieval thought and art with enduring beauty and mystery. The faith that united millions also divided them, driving crusades and reforms that reflected humanity's quest for meaning amid uncertainty and fear. Knights in shining armor, bound by chivalry and honor, have become legends, symbols of ideals that, though imperfect, inspired courage and loyalty across centuries. Yet, beneath these grand narratives lay the daily lives of countless ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, women, and children, whose resilience and toil built the foundations of society. Their stories remind us that history is not only made by rulers and warriors, but also by those who endure hardship, celebrate joy, and pass traditions through generations. Medieval Europe was a world of contradictions, harsh and beautiful, pious and violent, isolated and interconnected, a reflection of the human condition itself. The challenges of famine, plague, and war tested communities, but they also sparked innovations in agriculture, governance, and culture that shaped Europe's future. As feudal bonds loosened and new ideas spread, the medieval era set the stage for the flowering of art, science, and exploration that followed. The Renaissance was not a sudden break, but a gradual emergence from medieval shadows, carrying forward its legacies even as it questioned its assumptions. Understanding the medieval world helps us grasp the roots of many modern institutions, ideas, and conflicts, revealing how the past continues to influence our present. In a time without modern technology or communication, medieval people built societies sustained by faith, family, and fierce determination to survive and thrive. Their world may seem distant, but their hopes, fears, and dreams are echoes of our own, reminding us of our shared humanity across centuries. History invites us to reflect on change and continuity, on how societies evolve through struggle and renewal, and how the past shapes identity and destiny. The medieval era teaches us about resilience, how cultures adapt to upheaval, and how ideas endure even in darkness. As we look back, we can appreciate the medieval legacy in our languages, laws, art, and stories, threads connecting us to a rich, complex past. May the journey through medieval Europe inspire curiosity, respect, and wonder for the human story, a story still unfolding in every corner of our world today. Thank you for joining this voyage through time. The echoes of the Middle Ages remind us that history is alive, inviting us to learn, imagine, and carry its lessons forward.